Hello and welcome to another interesting webinar organized by the Initiative for the Study of Asian Catholics, or ISAC. Today, we are indeed very privileged to have an esteemed migration scholar who will present her work on the intricate relations between internal migration, interreligious relations, and Christian minorities with Pakistan as her empirical illustration. So let me first introduce myself. I'm Bubbles Beverly Asor, a sociologist of migration and religion based right now in Seoul, but I'm from Manila, and one of the coordinators of ISAC together with Michelle Chambon, who is also here, based in Singapore, Bernardo Brown based in Tokyo, but right now in Argentina, and James Bonaya, who is based in Chennai. So we're everywhere. So welcome to all of you, and we are looking forward to have another exciting discussion and presentation on a very timely topic on Asian Catholics. So without further ado, so what we're going to do tonight is first, Marta will present her work for 40 minutes. It will be followed by a discussion and a response from Bernardo, an anthropologist of migration and anthropologist of religion. Then we will open the floor to the audience for a Q&A session. So that's what we're going to do tonight. So let me first introduce our speaker. Dr. Marta Bivan Erdal is a research professor in migration studies at Peace Research Institute, Oslo, where she is co-director of the PRIO Migration Center. And as a human geographer, she's interested in the impacts of migration and transnationalism in both emigration and immigration contexts. So let us give our virtual applause to Marta.
Thank you so much, Bubbles, and thank you everyone for being here. So let me try and open my slides first and get that going. So I think now, hopefully you can see the slides. Wonderful. Thank you so much for letting me know that, Bernardo. So good afternoon and good morning and good evening, respectively, depending on where you are. It's wonderful to have the chance to present this work in this particular forum. I'm really happy about that. So thanks for the opportunity to do that. As you know, because you signed up, and as Bubbles already mentioned, I'll be speaking about work that I've conducted with good colleagues in Pakistan. And the title of this presentation is Christian Minorities, Internal Migration and Interreligious Relations in Youhanabad, Pakistan. And this work is drawing on a book chapter in a handbook on religion and contemporary migration. And if you're interested in reading that, please do let me know in case you don't have access to a library which can buy it, because of course some of these handbooks can be quite expensive. So I'd like to start off first by saying where this research is coming from. And as I mentioned, it's co-authored work with my colleague and friend Farooq Khan in Lahore in Pakistan. And I also wanted to share with you these photos that we took during fieldwork with our students and research assistants who were either from LUMS or from other colleges, Christian and non-Christian colleges in Lahore, whom we worked with. And so some of what I'll talk about is actually the process of doing research together in relation to religious minority majority divides in different kinds of ways, and how that's something which is important to reflect on, and I think also something which can be very personally rewarding for those involved, and something that maybe we ought to be discussing more also, at least in the Asian context that many of us are interested in. Again, thank you so much for ISAC and the team here for the opportunity to present this research here. And here's the reference if anyone is interested in it. But also just feel free to message me or let me know afterwards if you'd like to read the chapter itself. I wanted to start with these few images before I launch into the presentation itself, because I think they represent something about what I'm trying to convey here. So this particular area in Lahore in Pakistan is perhaps not what one would expect if seeing images from a Pakistani city. I don't know how many of those in the audience who are Pakistani or have visited Pakistan or even lived in the country before. Usually when I give talks based on research in Pakistan, whether that's in Europe or in other contexts, people maybe are not as familiar. But usually these types of images from what is the garden inside a convent are not what you would expect to see. And yet in Youhanabad, in Lahore, these are very, very common kinds of images that you'd have. And of course, there are also convents in other parts of Pakistan that you can also visit. And this image of doors is, I guess, more a sort of metaphor in terms of what we might be able to see if we look in through doors that are perhaps not the usual ones that we would like to look into. And indeed, we went knocking on a lot of doors of houses of people in Youhanabad when doing research there. And what I will share with you is basically what we learned from doing that. So I'd like to start off with a small vignette. Driving along the busy Firozpur Road in Lahore, a street leads into an area with a gate with a prominent cross high above, welcoming visitors to Youhanabad. The road becomes narrower, with small shops in every house on either side. There are stores with cloths, butchers with chicken and lamb meat on display outside. There are shops with shoes and others with jewelry. Like anywhere in Lahore, there are motorbikes everywhere, and people are busy going about their business. Driving further in, we stop and we are directed to a door across the street where we are told we can find the parish offices of St. John's Catholic Parish. The door is open and a man greets us and tells us we're expected before guiding us into a room with two sofas, a table, and chairs, where our interaction with the people in Youhanabad begins. So what I'll do this afternoon or evening or morning is to take you through a little bit of what we found out in that fieldwork and in our analysis of the data. And I'll do this in these segments. So first, I'll say a little bit about how on earth did a Christian majority area come about in a Pakistani city. It is a bit of a sort of odd occurrence. And I think a series interested in Asian Catholics is a very good place to discuss that a bit further. I'll then, again, as I mentioned, say a little bit about the research process and some reflections on the methods and the minority-majority divide when it comes to religion in that process that we had in our group. In the kind of more substantive part, I'd like to say a few words about a terrorist attack which struck in this very neighborhood in 2015, but also actually juxtapose that with interreligious coexistence, which is a very strong feature of this particular area as well. I'll then dig into two topics that I found really fascinating, maybe not surprising, but fascinating to see in this particular iteration in this Pakistani city. So the migration of Catholic priests and sisters in the context of that as a broader phenomenon, of course, within Asia, but globally as well. And then the role, especially in the education provision across faiths of Catholic orders, also in this particular urban neighborhood. And I'll then also end with the conclusion to a puzzle that I will introduce in a moment, which relates to the desire to stay at home as a religious minority, which we found among a majority of the residents and young adults of Youhanabad in Pakistan. At the very end, I'll also spend a few minutes reflecting a little bit on Asian Catholics and interreligious coexistence and what we might maybe learn from or take away from and later discuss from this particular example, also relating to other contexts. So, the evolution of a Christian majority area in a Pakistani city. For some of you, this might be quite familiar, for others not. So, just to sort of have some of the basic facts on the ground. According to the national census in Pakistan in 2017, about 1.27% of the population of Pakistan are Christian. Now, there are a lot of discussions around those numbers, of course. Probably there's some degree of non-reporting among Christians. We also know that the state expected the census to find about 200 million inhabitants, and indeed it found 220 million inhabitants. So I'm not sure about the exactness of the kind of 0.07 of that number, but it's a small minority. And compared with the previous census data about 15 years earlier, the proportion of Christians in Pakistan is decreasing, which is largely explained through either outmigration or lower fertility rates among Christians compared to the general population. But it's a small minority in a country which is very populous. So even with this estimate, that would suggest something like 2 or 3 million Christians in Pakistan, which could be slightly more even. In terms of the geography of the country, it's also important to note that it varies depending on where in the country you are. So Lahore is part of the province of Punjab, and there are in general more Christians living in Punjab than there would be, say, in Sindh or in other parts of the country. And rough estimates suggest that in Lahore, maybe as many as 4% of the population might be Christian. This is very uncertain, but these are the sort of estimates that people generally share when you ask them about it. So that sort of gives you some context of within Pakistan as well. The Christian minority is small, but in Lahore, it's perhaps a little bit bigger than in the country on average. But how come a Christian majority area? How is that possible within this context? And also knowing the history of Christianity in Pakistan, which is relatively new and it's relatively linked to colonial times. There were, of course, Christians in India way before that, but in these particular parts of what was back then, maybe not different countries, that wasn't really so much the case. There were probably some, but not very many. And so it's a much more recent history in this particular geographic area. And the answer to how this came about is, I think, quite fascinating. So Youhanabad itself, in a sense, is a project of the Catholic Church, one of our interviewees told us. So basically, the Catholic Church, as it does where it's present, often has different types of projects supporting people who are struggling. So in this case, this was people who were in general poor and who were also Christian. And there was an effort to see what could be done. And as this city, Lahore, as many other cities, of course, was developing and growing, it was possible at that point to buy land. And so the church, and more specifically a Belgian priest, bought a lot of land and set up housing. And there was this sort of idea around how that should be done to be something where people could also support themselves, not necessarily a sort of pure charity, but trying to find ways in which people could get land and house and then come and like sort of add on to that house and try and see if they could make a livelihood and build their lives there and to settle down there. And we saw in the different interviews that we had that time and time again, the same sort of narrative came about. Not everyone was aware of exactly who it was that had bought the land, but there was this knowledge that there was a sort of Christian origin to it. And in some cases, there was a very clear sense that it was set up for Christians only. In other cases, maybe people weren't quite sure whether that was the case or not. Initially, it was, but very soon the area became slightly more diverse and certainly more diverse among Christians, so not only Catholics, but other Christians also settled down in the area. But the whole idea was that people would get this land and support to build this one-room house and then basically fend for themselves. However, of course, there is this sort of context of persecution of Christians in Pakistan as a backdrop here as well, also back then. And one of the ideas, apparently at the time, also was that it would be good for Christians in Pakistan to have somewhere to come to in cases of extreme persecution in village areas. And so the whole area of Youhanabad, which today maybe counts something like 100,000, maybe even 200,000 people, depending on how you sort of delimit geographically the space of it, um, is predominantly Christian, not only, but predominantly Christian. And the reason why people have come there is often quite mixed, but very often it's linked, of course, to the situation they've been experiencing in their home areas, often across Punjab. So sometimes that's linked to very extreme religious persecution, unfortunately, and that still is the case. Other times it's more a combination of livelihood struggles and being a minority, which then has an even harder time than other people who also might be struggling. And then Youhanabad offering an opportunity, which for Christians then becomes a particular opportunity, even though that doesn't necessarily mean it's an easy life once they get there, but at least it's a place where they can go. And some of our interlocutors also refer to this in terms of the safety as a safe haven for themselves and their families in general, but of course also in religious terms, that this was a place where they can not only manage financially and economically, but also in religious terms. And as I'll come back to later on in the presentation, education plays a key role here as well, because there is a huge offering of various types of education for children, but also for youth and for young people, vocational trainings and other types of trainings that would have been much more hard to access, especially for many of the Christians who now live there, if they remain in their remote areas. So maybe not always because they're Christian, but through a combination of being a Christian minority, as well as coming from areas where maybe that educational offer is not there anyway, at all. So there are interesting narratives around how this area came about. And it's interesting that it's really hard actually to find written material about this narrative of how this area came about. Even in the sort of church archives, there are some things, but probably for a variety of different reasons, it hasn't really been a priority also from the Catholic Church's side in Pakistan to write up the story of how this came about and how it has been managed. So in our context, we were doing this research as part of a project called MIGNEX, which was nothing to do with Catholics in Asia or Christians as minorities at all. It was a project about migration and development. But it so happened that we were doing research in 3 different areas in Pakistan and in nine other countries as well. And in the Pakistani context, we wanted to explore an urban area and to try and see what dynamics might be there. And because this particular urban area, as I mentioned, is relatively recent in the sense that it was established only in 1965. It's a really interesting area to look at to see how internal mobilities come about and how they matter. And also because of this particularity of the religious mix of people who live in this area, it was selected for closer study. And so one of the things that was puzzling us is that in the survey data that we collected, we did both qualitative work and survey data collection. We found that quite a significant proportion of the young adults that were surveyed did not desire or plan to leave Pakistan, and definitely not to leave Youhanabad. So there was a very clear sense that if they were leaving, they would leave Pakistan entirely, because Youhanabad would be the place in Pakistan they would want to be living in as residents there. But it was perhaps a little bit surprising, at least if you read this through the prism, if anyone tries to Google Youhanabad, Christians, minorities, persecution, Pakistan, the types of narratives you get are very, very one-sided and very clear-cut. So in a sense, you might expect that, of course, if you had an opportunity to leave, you would probably want to do that as a persecuted religious minority. But instead, we actually found that the migration aspirations of young adults were relatively low. We can always wonder what does low or high mean in these contexts, of course, and that we can discuss, but perhaps a little bit surprising. So under 1/4, 22% of the young adults we surveyed would prefer to leave Youhanabad in the next 5 years. And interestingly, also, we found that even if given the necessary papers, so given the passport and the ticket, and with no risks in terms of having to cross borders irregularly or anything like that, still they would not want to migrate to a richer country. Again, is that high or low? That can be debated. But I think it's an interesting jumping off point as a contrast to some of those perspectives that are often there when we discuss Christians in countries like Pakistan, where there are huge problems with persecution, including the blasphemy laws, etc. And yet, this is kind of what we heard when asking young people living in this particular area. So what I'll try and sort of weave through in the presentation and come back to at the end is how can these results be understood and explained precisely in the context that Christians are a persecuted minority in Pakistan, but also, as it appears in our findings, very patriotic Pakistanis. I don't think the latter should perhaps surprise us at all, but I think it's interesting to dive into a bit deeper and to try and reflect on and see what that means. And I also realize that this is on the backdrop of very severe religious persecution of Christians and of other religious minorities in Pakistan. I just want to stress that I'm not at all questioning that or taking that lightly. But I think at the sort of aggregate bird's view picture, it's also useful to look at it and see what we might learn from that as well. So who were we doing this research? As I mentioned, we were a group which had students from both LUMS and also from other Christian and non-Christian colleges in Lahore. And we were doing this work as a part of the MIGNEX project. So I'm going to say a little bit about what we did and then reflect a little bit on the composition of the group. You can see a little bit now through our different ages. There's one white person standing out a bit, but then I'll tell you a little bit more about who we were and what that actually meant for the research and the process and our mutual learning within that. So mapping a Christian neighborhood of Youhanabad in Lahore. I don't know how many of you maybe are familiar with trying to map urban areas for a survey, for instance, or maybe just if traveling, you maybe use Google Maps or Open Maps, you try and figure places out. That works better or not so well, depending on where you are in the world, maybe, and how well the kind of map structure works. In some of the most urban and most sort of dense urban areas in Asia, I think it's not necessarily always that easy to do that. And even with satellite imagery, it's not that simple. We tried to sort of make sense of what are the boundaries of Youhanabad. We looked at some of the old maps and sort of plots of land that were bought in the 60s. Clearly, the area has grown since then because people have been buying more land, and we didn't really manage to weave together the entire history of, who actually bought different parts of the land that is now Youhanabad at later points. We also heard that probably the city of Lahore actually maybe, gave some of land later on in the process as well. We gave up a little bit on sort of finding out that urban history to the end, but that's maybe a project for someone else in the future to figure out. But we tried to, at least by walking and using motorbikes and sort of going around the area, try to understand from the people who live there and work there, where are the sort of perimeters of Youhanabad. And one of the things we could see, for instance, were when there were a lot of mosques, that was probably not Youhanabad. So within Youhanabad itself, one of the unique and interesting features is that there are no mosques inside Youhanabad, but just across the street, on one of the sides, if you look at this sort of where it says F and H and J, on the other sides of those red lines there that we've put on the map, there were more mosques. And so within parts of Youhanabad, you could also hear the call to prayer from some of those mosques outside, whereas some parts of Youhanabad, which is very unusual in Pakistan, you actually couldn't hear that at all. So we tried to map this area and get to know it and try to understand, which are the older parts and the newer parts. How does that matter in terms of whether there are maybe more Catholics living there or also some of the other Christian denominations there? There were a lot of Protestants, a lot of Baptists, a lot of Methodists, and a complete sort of mushrooming of various other types of churches and some institutions that maybe are more better described as sort of NGO-like structures, which I can also go into in the questions if someone is more interested in the kind of diversity within the Christian community in Youhanabad. So what we did was within about 2-3 weeks in November, December 2021, we were basically spending our time there. We did about 40 informal interviews, and then we did focus groups, so group discussions with groups of people. 4 of those, 2 with women and 2 with men, where we tried to talk to people who had more or less experience with international migration specifically. In this particular area, almost everyone had experience with migrating to Youhanabad, either themselves or their parents or someone else in the family if they were young people. But fewer of them perhaps had experience of international migration or a family member having gone abroad, but some of them also had that as well. So some of the interesting discussions we had in the team were about how to do the field work. And this was really interesting on many levels for me and my colleagues, sort of trying to also play a role as teachers in this, but also in terms of the sort of Muslim, non-Muslim reality here. And for myself, both being a foreigner and being a Catholic was very interesting because things were very much upside down. So usually I would ask my Pakistani colleagues or students, about things and understand the context. But in this case, some of our research assistants and students actually hadn't been, well, they hadn't been to a church, which maybe isn't that surprising, but they hadn't actually knowingly at least spoken to a Christian, at least not a Christian who wasn't a foreigner. And for a couple of them, they hadn't really spoken to a foreigner before they met me either. So that was also quite new for them. So some of the things we discussed were when we were invited to come to Mass on the Sunday, which was quite an obvious and natural thing, but sort of to do that and to sort of then be able to chat with people afterwards and maybe have people to interview and understand their perspectives on life in Youhanabad. My student colleagues were wondering, how to dress for a Catholic Mass. And they were also really worried as Muslims in Pakistan that they would be seen as intruding in, a religious space for a minority, but also in a sacred space in a church. And so they were really worried about whether it was all right for them to come along or not. And one of the things which was really nice to see was that by sort of staying in this area for these 2 or 3 weeks, and we went to Mass at least twice, and then we also visited a lot of the churches and the schools run also by nuns and by priests. Their sort of level of comfort with being with people who were Christian and Pakistani just increased so much, and their own sort of reflection around what does it mean to be a religious minority and what are these people like was just really fascinating to observe and also to share in our evening debriefs. So I'll share a couple of sort of tasters from that with you here. So one team member who was among those who said, I don't think I've actually ever spoken to a Christian before this research assistant role, reflected on how the sermons are in Arabic in mosques, so we don't know what we're saying. Prayers are translated into Urdu in the church. Our imams are quoting verses in Arabic, here it's in Urdu. It was amazing to see the Christians praying for the first time. There was one thing after the other, which was fascinating. And even the verses were similar to the ones that we have as Muslims. Because, of course, because it was in Urdu, they understood everything that was happening. At least as if what was being said was very understood by them. And this one thing after another was linked to the fact that this particular mass that he was referring to was the first Sunday of Advent. And there was a Catholic school just nearby, and there really was one thing after the other with the lighting of candles, and there were some children who'd prepared some extra things for after Mass as well. So there were some extra things there compared to perhaps a regular Sunday. And one of the female team members observed that there were several young girls in the procession that they were keenly participating, and they were altar servants. And so especially the female research assistants were very intrigued by the participation of children, both boys and girls, in the mass, and that was noted. And they thought of that as something which was positive, which I thought was quite interesting, that this was one of the things that, with an outsider view and drawing on a sort of generally Pakistani Sunni Muslim frame of reference, that was kind of one of their takeaways from participating in this mass. So as I mentioned, we had a lot of interesting reflections and discussions, both outside of the sort of setting of being in Youhanabad when we were just in our own group discussing, but also on field work itself. And sort of trying to balance what does it mean to be an insider or an outsider, whether, then as a Pakistani or as a foreigner, as a Christian and Catholic, or as a Muslim. And what does religious positionality in research actually entail in a context like that? And what does it also entail when you're working with students, where you're trying to enhance their own sense of reflexivity and of learning both about their own role, about research methodologies, but at the same time also some factual knowledge about what is it that we're actually seeing. And I found that in particularly interesting also maybe from an ecumenical point of view, trying to convey some basic knowledge about Christianity to people who frankly didn't know anything, while at the same time being honest about my own position as a Catholic within the Christian landscape, which in Youhanabad was quite particular. So that was very interesting, also trying to balance this sort of Christian Muslim, but also Catholic role in this particular research. So Moving then slightly on and maybe back to the more expected, perhaps sinister aspects of this. As I mentioned briefly in the beginning, there was a terrorist attack, suicide bombing in Youhanabad in 2015. This image is taken from a news story on the BBC back then with a photo from the AFP. And this was something which was covered very widely. Perhaps some of you would remember it. It's 10 years ago, but still, perhaps some of you would remember that there were these suicide bombings in two churches. So both the main Catholic and the main Anglican church in the area, was a sort of parallel suicide bombing going on. And many people were killed, many people were injured. There was a whole big court case issue around that afterwards, which I won't go into detail now, but if you're interested, I'm very happy to try and discuss that in the questions afterwards. What I will do with you instead is to share with you a quote from an interview with the parish priest, who was the parish priest at the time in St. John's Catholic Church. So he told us, I was present when the blast happened. I was inside the church with approximately 3,000 people. At that time, the situation of Pakistan was not good. We always had more than 20 young boys patrolling the church. It happened at the second mass that Sunday. The blast occurred at 11:10 or 11:12. One of our young boys, Akash Bashir, gave his life to protect us. He saw the suicide bomber. Akash grabbed him from his back, and that is when the blast happened. His whole body was cut into pieces. It was at the front gate of our church. At the same time, the second bomb blast happened in Christchurch. Fortunately, at the time of the bomb, most of the people, including the security women, were inside the church. If the suicide bomber had come inside the church, there would have been a massacre. We can't say the blast was a war between Muslims and Christians. At that time, the situation in Pakistan was not good. Also, our Holy Father, Pope Francis, is always present with us. He advises us to help and respect each other. And I should note this interview was conducted in 2021 when Pope Francis was the Pope. I'd also like to just note that Akash Bashir is currently in the process of canonization in the Catholic Church and the first Pakistani-born ever to be in that process at the moment. Now, there's a lot to take in from this quote. I'm aware of that. I think what I found, interesting and powerful, of course, was that this priest was still there and was so open to talk about what happened, and that this was a very, very vibrant parish when we visited 6 years later on. But I think what was also quite interesting was that very, very quickly when we discussed this, he wanted to convey to me and my colleague, who is a Pakistani professor in Lahore and a Muslim, how he thought about what happened in relation to the situation in Lahore and in Pakistan, in relation to Christian-Muslim relations, and then in relation to how coexistence works in Youhanabad. And he also anchored this very clearly within the frame of the Catholic Church with a reference to Pope Francis. And as we found out, this was quite common. So this sort of awareness of suicide bombings, death of, in general, a lot of risks to Pakistani Christians as a persecuted minority in the country in general, but also with discrimination in the labor market, with risks that were posed, especially when they were not in Youhanabad, but outside of Youhanabad in terms of various things that might happen to them. That awareness was always conveyed to us alongside this other conviction in a way that, we belong here, this is our place, and we need to figure out how we can work this out. And I think without saying the word extremism, the priest here conveys a sense that was also very clear among many of our interlocutors, which was that there isn't a war between Muslims and Christians, but there are extremists. And in this particular case, Islamist extremists who are not part of this idea of wanting to have any sense of coexistence. But that there was also this hope that is really not the majority. It is just a few. So just to continue a bit with some further quotes that I think illustrate this further. One of our interviewees, a security guard, David, told us, this community is like a home. In a home, the members of the family quarrel sometimes, and it's not an issue. That's my point of view. I think Pakistan is our home. Muslims and non-Muslims are like a family. Just like ups and downs happen in a home, they also occur in the community. And so people then brought it to different scales in different kinds of way in the way that they discussed it. And rather than the national level scale, most of the people that we spoke with related it actually to their local neighborhood. And in particular, I think Nadia's comment here illustrates that. So she says, we eat each other's food and share everyday items. They send us sweets at Christmas, and we also send them kheer and siwan for Eid. So I think without sort of diminishing in any way the sort of very real issues and problems that are there, these types of voices are ones that we very rarely hear from Christians in Pakistan. And I think it's very important to actually be able to share them and to convey them as well. And also their sort of sense of urgency that coexistence really requires the efforts of everyone. And I think what is interesting about Youhanabad as an area is that it puts the sort of majority minority regular breakdown in a different light in the Pakistani context, because within this particular area, Christians are actually the majority, and that allows them a different position and allows them a platform from which to also reflect in different ways than they would otherwise. But then the question is, how do they then treat their Muslim neighbors when they are in the minority? And at least these of our interlocutors are very clear about what they thought that should look like. So I'll then turn to some of the points that are related more specifically also to the role of the Catholic Church. And I could talk more about the Catholic laity as well. I've chosen two examples here that are related to more organized and institutional parts of Catholicism, but I'm happy to also discuss other parts in the Q&A later on. So the migration of Catholic priests and religious sisters, I think, is a very common theme. We all know this from around the world. This is a picture from the Mexican border back in 1926, from a quite recent piece on sister immigrants that was published earlier this year. I know that also very recently there was actually a seminar here in ISAC on working with migrants where this very topic was also touched on for Asia specifically. So I know that there are a lot of experts in the room here on this topic specifically and on religious sisters and mobility and migration. So let me just maybe give you a couple of glimpses from Youhanabad, which maybe underscore the pictures that we maybe know, and maybe the novelty is that this is of course also happening within the Pakistani context, which is perhaps not one that we often associate with the Catholic Church in much detail. So I'm going to use the example of Sister Angeline, who had moved internally within Sri Lanka when she was young and had at a later point been sent by her order to the Philippines for education and formation. Later on, she returned back to Sri Lanka before she came to Pakistan, and then also to Youhanabad within Pakistan. She'd been several places in Pakistan. When we spoke with her, she was leaving Youhanabad to return to Sri Lanka not long after our conversations. Meanwhile, we also met a young woman who'd entered the convent in Youhanabad, a Pakistani woman who'd moved to Youhanabad to enter the convent from another part of Pakistani Punjab. And this was, of course, as it is, after a long period of deliberation. And she was about to go to Sri Lanka for her first year of education and formation in the order with the nuns in one of the larger convents of this order. And of course, I think it goes without saying that for this young woman, this was the first time she would have a passport. It was the first time she would fly. It's the first time that she would leave Pakistan. During her stay in Youhanabad, Sister Angeline had mastered a basic level of Urdu and had, among other, been involved in providing vocational training for young women, including a program to learn how to sew, where the convent provided participants with sewing machines upon successful graduation, enabling them to earn an income from their homes. Sister Angeline provided many young women not only with vocational training, but as she explained, with a conviction that they had it within themselves to learn new things and to manage life. So like I mentioned, I think for this particular audience, there's not that much surprising in this happening. I think what is interesting is that it is, of course, happening also in the context of Pakistan. And before I move on to the educational part and move on towards also ending, I'd also just like to stress that there were so many different orders present within this area of Youhanabad, and with so many ties also of internal mobility across Pakistan, but also to other parts of the world. And I think one of the most sort of eye-opening conversations I had was with this very, very old Belgian nun who was something like 96 or 97 years old, and whose Urdu was very good. Mine isn't, but we managed to speak in a mix of English and French. And so she had been in Pakistan since before it became Pakistan as a nun, as a very, very young person coming there back then. And I think that just, I mean, the sort of the histories and the oral histories of nuns also in Pakistan is again an area where there is very little work done. Some orders are doing some things, but I think there's much more that could perhaps be done to help document these important women's histories in this context. But moving then on to education. So the educational expansion in Youhanabad is absolutely huge. I think in many contexts in Asia, there's a lot of educational expansion, higher levels of literacy, etc. This is a well-known fact. In this particular context, what is interesting is that almost all the schools are run by Christian, different types of Christian institutions. So some of them are Catholic orders. There's also a church run by the Church of Pakistan, which is an Anglican church, and there are some others that are run by organizations that have Christian funding from abroad, but the vast majority had, in one way or another, a Catholic anchoring. And so the photo here is from the grounds of one of the schools that is run by a Catholic religious sisters. And there are also many others that are run by priests, again with funding from abroad. Questions of fees are always discussed. How much should they be? How little should they be? Should this be for free or not? So very kind of typical questions around education and development and the opportunities that one should have or not. And another example, which I think was the most interesting example actually of an educational institution there, which was not at the primary level, but which was a vocational training center. Again, might be familiar to many people who know the Don Bosco institutes around the world and the work of the Salesians of Don Bosco. In this particular context, they were running a dormitory also, and they had a lot of students who were coming from different parts of Pakistan. Mostly these were Christian students, mostly Catholics, but not only. And then in terms of pupils who came in for the sort of day programs to study during the day but didn't live in the dormitory, they also had a lot of Muslims who were coming in from other parts of Lahore or indeed other parts of Youhanabad, because there is a Muslim minority that also lives in this particular area. And the trainings here ranged from air condition repair, basic electrician work, welding, operating various machines, but also included beautician training. And the Don Bosco rector, who was showing us around and telling us the story of their work, was very proud to tell us that there were also men taking the beautician training, which he thought was a big success. He also said that there were a few women doing different types of training that were not in relation to hairdressing and beautician, but he said the progress was still quite slow and probably related to the needs in the labor market and the expectations of women and families themselves. But it was interesting that he wanted to point this particular fact out to us. And then a brief fieldwork note, because in Pakistan in general, getting good coffee, as in from an espresso can, is not very easy. But as you may have noticed in the quote that I just had, in this particular institute, there was a Pakistani priest who was leading the work, and then there was a Mexican and an Italian. And so you might perhaps guess that there was good coffee and also a lot of debates around what that good coffee should actually be like and how it should be made. So that was quite enjoyable when we were visiting them and also were invited in for coffee with them. Okay, so let me move towards the closing part where I'd like to come back to this conundrum, in a sense, of the desire to stay at home as a religious minority and as a religious minority which is experiencing persecution, especially if we look at it at the national level, perhaps a bit less so, looking specifically at Youhanabad, but even there also certainly experiencing different types of difficulties and discrimination as a religious minority. So one of the things that we saw very clearly is that for minorities and Christian minorities in particular, the sense of being a patriotic Pakistani was very important. Very often when I'm in Pakistan, I see a lot of Pakistani flags on desks, on walls, and everywhere else. It's a patriotic country for important historical and complicated historical reasons. This is no less true in the Christian context. And I think that's interesting and important just to be aware of. However, there is this challenge that any minority within a national context often has much more heavy demands put on them to prove their legitimate and natural right to belong. And so there is this sort of thing to be aware of and maybe careful about in terms of how hard you have to prove that you actually are a patriotic Pakistani if you also are a Christian, and would that be recognized or not, and by whom? Which is a very sort of sore and ambivalent topic, which also surfaced in many of the conversations that we have. At the same time, I think one of the quotes from one of our interviewees, Aliyah, really sums up a lot of the sentiment that we experienced during our fieldwork in the area. So she said, there is some development here, including the metro station with the name Youhanabad on it. So things are moving in a good direction. We are hopeful. That's why we're working for the education of the children so they can realize that that the future here will bring change. So I think I want to just end with a few reflections that perhaps we can also take forward in the discussion if you're interested. Sort of thinking through Asian and maybe Catholics in general and relationships to interreligious coexistence and how we might think about that as Catholics as well as researchers. So this is again an image from St. John's Church in Youhanabad, and you can see the sort of Advent colors that are going on there. And this was at the tail end of the pandemic, hence some of the face masks that you can see. So I wanted to share a brief reflection here that links to some of the work that we've done in the book chapter that we've published, and also some other work that I'm doing that relates to coexistence and Catholic social teaching. So one of the things that I found very useful was reading Anna Rowland's book, Towards the Politics of Communion, on Catholic social teaching in dark times, where she says something which is really, really obvious, but at the same time, I think, at least in the social sciences, very often ignored, especially perhaps in the European context, which is extremely secularized. And so that filters through in terms of what is being seen or not seen, which questions are being asked and not asked. And I think to a lesser degree is a problem, perhaps in the Asian context. So basically, she sort of suggests that the religious and the social of everyday life are joined. And so trying to disentangle them when doing research or ignoring one doesn't really make sense. But paying attention to how they work together and really taking seriously the transcendental aspects of faith when doing that is incredibly important. And I think often a lack, at least in research, in the European context. I was also quite inspired by Fratelli Tutti throughout this process, which I'd read before, of course, and trying to think around this question of coexistence and how, especially when speaking with families who have lost loved ones, and this includes, of course, people who are priests or religious sisters who have family members who have been killed, perhaps in one of these suicide bombings, but also in terms of disappearances that do happen, forced conversions, etc. And still this very strong sense that coexistence really is where we have to go. It has to be possible, and that being so incredibly also anchored in faith for very many of these people. And I also dug up this quote then from Gaudium et Spes, which I think really resonates with some of those convictions that we met among people there, in particular in relation to this deeper level of interpersonal relations. And that reminds me especially of some of the quotes of some of the women with this sort of very banal everyday encounters of sharing food and of watching each other's children or taking down each other's laundry when the rain starts coming, which is about living together at a very basic level. And it's not really about trying to convince the other of one's own truth in any sense at all, but it's just about recognizing each other's mutual humanity at a very sort of basic, but at the same time, very, very profound level. So to end then, I also want to share this quote from George Weigel's book that I found very helpful in also thinking about this. I'm not sure I've completely managed to grasp everything that he maybe means with this, and I'm sure there are ways to unpack or also criticize this. But to end, I'll also read this. So he says, Catholics are called to work for unity and authentic human community across the religious, sectarian, ethnic, racial, and political divides that separate people by rejecting prejudice and discrimination and by being mediators of those encounters that make possible the transformation of difference into dialogue and plurality into pluralism. And I guess my basic sort of question potentially for discussion is, what can we learn from the Christians and also the Catholics of Youhanabad in relation to questions of coexistence? And I think very sadly, these are questions that are very, very pertinent to where I'm based in Oslo in Norway, where we just yesterday heard the news that a social worker was killed this weekend while doing her night shift by a man who was doing that out of right-wing extremist convictions. She was of Ethiopian origin and a Muslim. And so right now where I'm here, these debates about religious coexistence, about how we can and have to live together and recognize each other's humanity are very, very pressing. So thanks again for allowing me to speak, and I'll stop sharing and I look forward to the comments and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, for that very interesting presentation. May I now call on Bernardo for his comments on Marta's presentation?
Thank you, Bubbles. And hello, everybody. Hi again, Martha. Well, thank you very much for asking me to give some comments on this paper. I really enjoyed reading it and I really enjoyed the presentation. And I work in Sri Lanka. I'm an anthropologist. I have been working with Catholics in Sri Lanka for the last 20 years. And there's a lot of parallels, a lot of things that are in common. And actually, I always thought that I wanted to do some research in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, like Martha is doing, because there's a lot of similarities, and I wanted to point out some of those similarities but some differences there. So I and asking Martha to hopefully comment on those couple of a few differences that I found. But there's first I would say that well uh, yeah, two things. One is that over the years working in Sri Lanka, I came across a lot of Pakistani Catholics, basically a lot of seminarians who were in Sri Lanka. I work with part of my work is at the National Seminary of Sri Lanka, and there were religious orders often brought some of those students to for part of their training to Sri Lanka. So I came across many of the people that Martha is also talking about, and many Sri Lankan priests who had spent many years living in Pakistan, and were even like some of them argued that they were more comfortable in Urdu and eating Pakistani food than Sri Lankan food, and they were usually often made fun of for those things when they went back to Sri Lanka after many years. So there were many interesting connections. But the first time that I came across this and I became interested I was yeah kind of surprised to learn about the Pakistani Catholic minority was exactly around 10 years ago, around 2015, because there were a lot of Pakistanis, Catholic refugees in Sri Lanka. I say in quotes Catholic refugees because they were not officially refugees. And when you think of refugees in Sri Lanka, you think about outgoing refugees, right? People escaping, particularly after the conflict, the Tamil separatist conflict. A lot of Tamils, including many Tamil Catholics, uh, looked for asylum in other countries. So really, Sri Lanka did not have like an asylum policy, a refugee policy to receive people from outside. But because of they were members of SARC, it was easy to come to Sri Lanka for Pakistanis to come to Sri Lanka without a visa, or it was easy to get the visas. And a lot of Catholics from Pakistan were had moved to Sri Lanka, and they were kind of like hosted by particularly one diocese, and it was problematic because they were not officially refugees. They were not allowed to work, and they were not allowed to go to school. So they were kind of dependent on the welfare of the of other like of Sri Lankan Catholics in that particular case, which brings me to the point um, of um, of this kind of like Catholic umbrella, no Catholic like networks, international networks of like safety nets that are available, and that Martha like talked about like as a motivating factor for people to move into this like neighborhoods of Lahore because there were opportunities for work, for studying, for improving your life, for safety, and kind of being in touch with a more like international community. But okay, so for my first comment then there is that um, a lot of Pakistani Catholics and Christians left during those times. So it is, I agree with this, how do you call it? Immobility preference, no desire of people to stay. But I would also ask, well, to what extent do you think that is, the reality of 2021 but how many of those have already left? If I think about, I don't know, Tamil Catholics in Sri Lanka, I could see that a lot that they want to stay, but the reality is that half of them live in Paris and half of them in Toronto, half of them in London in the first place. So the ones that stay are, amongst the ones that stayed, you can see a high, let's say, desire, willingness to stay, but of what is the overall picture of the numbers of like Pakistani Catholics who are desiring to stay, where have they gone and where are they currently settled? So that will give us a more like a like balanced view of that immobility preference, I think. The other comment. So there are several things that are connected, similar. For example, the high concentration of Catholics being majority or minority at the same time. That is something that I've always noted in Sri Lanka, and I thought it was like unique and interesting. In the case of Sri Lanka, we're talking about around 6% or 6.5% of Catholics, so it's a much more substantial Catholic community than in the case of Pakistan. In Sri Lanka, particularly, there are contentions between the Sinhala Catholics and Tamil Catholics. So even though we're talking about 6% of the national population, we cannot think of a unified 6% of a Catholic community. We are talking about a Catholic community that has a lot of very strong historical divisions. But we have the situation of being majority and minority at the same time. We have a history of violence and tension. We have a situation of discrimination similar to what we find in Pakistan. And in Sri Lanka, we also have a question of terrorism and against Catholics. And it's even like more recent than in the case of, I guess it was more punctual, more like specific, like a one-off thing, but it was very violent, and it like changed a lot the relation of Catholics with other communities. What I thought was interesting to me was this idea of also, again, majority, going back to the majority minority Catholics. We're talking about a high concentration of Catholics, right, in a particular area. Now, this is important, I think, question here. In the case of Sri Lanka, the reason why they're concentrated is more historical. It has to do with missionary work and colonialism, that they focus on very particular regions, particularly like coastal regions where they settled. So it's not like this like contemporary migration of people to this particular area. So I wanted to ask, I was wondering what happens in terms of politics. In the case of Sri Lanka, if you, in these regions, only Catholic politicians will win elections or will be candidates, or if it's not a Catholic politician, it will necessarily be somebody who has a good relationship with the Catholic minority, because they need the votes in order to get into office and be a representative in this area. So I don't know how that works in Pakistan. So I would be curious to know a bit about that. Let me see what other comment I had here. Oh, okay. This idea, it's interesting, this idea of like moving into this area for different reasons. I also I very much like the idea that migration has like multiple drivers, right? And this idea that I think it becomes very clear in your project and in this paper that making problematizing the narrative of migration based on either on violence or on economic necessity. There are much more like complex notions, and the way people develop their migration narrative is much more complex and combines many more things. A few years ago, we wrote the introduction to book we edited with Brenda Yo at NUS, which was called Asian Migrants and Religious Experience. And what we argued was that you could not make this clear separation between migrant and refugee and missionary, because the reality was that, or economic migrant and transnational migrant, the realities were that people were building their migration narrative, putting different arguments together and different reasons together. So the idea, we used the concept of mobility because we thought it was much more useful in this particular case to try to reflect the complexity of this different dimensions. Now, going back to what I was just saying, my last two small comments. Okay, this idea of like migrating into and the internal migration into one place, isn't it creating a sense of like a ghettoization of the Catholic community? And like I felt reading your article, maybe I'm wrong, but I felt a sense of like people being like pushed out of other areas or places where they were before into these neighborhoods because of safety, because of economic opportunities, because of education, as you mentioned. But I felt that they were kind of like the place was being ghettoized. And what I felt was very different from Sri Lanka was that despite the problems that you have in Sri Lanka, uh, everybody would have a pretty clear notion of like Catholicism and pretty clear notion of Christianity and a familiarity with, particularly with Catholicism, that regardless of their Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim background. And I felt that what was very interesting in your paper was the research assistants actually who were so like unfamiliar with Catholicism. So I thought, well, if you can talk a little bit more about this problems confronted when we talk about interreligious coexistence and dialogue. And okay, so I think I should let you speak more than more than me. The other thing, one more, one more comment. There was also in Sri Lanka we have this question of like being a Catholic and a patriot, and a Sri Lankan and a Catholic, right? Like in Pakistan, we have that similar tension. And what happened in the case of Sri Lanka many times was that the way it was played out was in becoming a very nationalist. Some sectors becoming very nationalist and very almost like chauvinist. And a few years ago, in the Sinhala Church, among Sinhalese Catholics, like the enemy was a like Tamil Catholic that had to be denounced for being separatist. But in recent years, it's been the evangelical Christian. Okay, so making a big like a stark contrast by defining us by by rejecting them as other Christians, which of course was also problematic, because at the end of the day we're talking about groups of Christians, but they were trying to like artificially create new divisions. Anyway, I'll stop there because if not, it's too long. But I'm glad to have heard your presentation and read this paper. As I said before, I've been thinking about this many years, and I wanted to do some project there because I think there's so many comparative things. Even looking at the pictures of the Don Bosco schools, and it's like exactly the same buildings, so similar. Or the situation with the coffee cups and drinking coffee. In Sri Lanka, we had the director of the seminary had I've been spent many years in Italy, and then had come back and started this like a like vegetable garden, and he wanted the students to eat salad before every dinner. And of course Sri Lankan students were not happy at all about that imposition of the rector. But I thought that the circulation of like priests and nuns was always very interesting. It gave this kind of cosmopolitan environment there. Okay, so thank you very much again, and thank you for letting me comment on this, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you very much, Bernardo. Not so bad, quite early in the morning in Argentina right now. Thank you. Thank you for those wonderful comments, insightful comments. Marta, would you like to respond to Bernardo?
Thank you. Yes, briefly, also leaving time for any other reactions or comments from others here. Yeah, thanks, Bernardo, so much for your kind and gracious comments, and also for being able to give them so early in the morning. That's very impressive. Um, yeah, I think the Sri Lanka-Pakistan parallels are interesting and definitely something we might want to talk about further. I've also been doing some research in Sri Lanka a long time ago and then also a little bit more recently. But interestingly, there my research is with Muslims. And especially we've been looking at the northern Muslims who were evicted from the Jaffna area, etc. So in a new project now with colleagues from Colombo, we're also looking at particular areas. And one of the areas we'll probably be doing research in next year is one of the areas where there are a lot of Catholics. So then I've already noted that I should, I should probably contact you before we do that as well, because as you mentioned in the aftermath of the terror, um, yeah, the tensions between Catholics and Muslims, I think, have been rising, especially also in this particular local area, because of the usual thing where there's limited jobs, there's limited land, there's limited resources, and that never necessarily helps to ease tensions. So looking forward to also explore some of your work that I haven't read yet. So I'll try and comment briefly on a couple of the things that you noted. In terms of the immobility, and how many of them are there, I'm hoping to go to Pakistan in October, so I might try to find out. Certainly, when I've been there, I've been back a couple of times, and some of the religious sisters, of course, have been moved on to other convents within the country or also elsewhere. And the same with some of the parish priests who are now then maybe parish priests in other parts of the country. In terms of other people, we did look into to what extent is some people staying enabled by the fact that they do have relatives abroad who say send remittances and therefore enable their staying in a kind of dignified and meaningful way. Fewer than we thought actually had relatives abroad. Um, and I think some of this is because Youhanabad is seen as a destination, because it offers sufficient opportunities. And I think also because the opportunities to go to, say, Australia or even South Korea or the US or Europe or Canada, where we would know that there might be some opportunities if you're in the unlikely event you're successful, to establish yourself and maybe naturalize and have that as a permanent move. That just doesn't seem realistic for people at all, which, largely they're right to have that assessment. What is more common is temporary labor migration, mainly to the Gulf. And here we have these electricians, AC repair people, and beauticians. And so there's quite a lot of Gulf migration. And among women, there's quite a lot of nurse migration to the Gulf as well. So I'm not sure, how these Pakistani Catholic nurses relate to Filipino nurses elsewhere, and there are like so few of them, but they do exist. And so that's also like a small strand that is happening. But in terms of more sort of permanent ideas of moving, part of it is that life in Youhanabad is livable for most. And partly it's just the pure impossibility of being able to manage international migration. So it maybe isn't so much in a way what you say that they might not want to, but just it's not possible. Which is also why this sort of we were surprised with the finding that only a third said that they would go if they were offered money, tickets, passport, the opportunity to migrate legally. It was a third, so many more than would say otherwise that they would want to go, which was about a fifth. But still, maybe not as many as we thought. So it's interesting and something I'd also like to continue to look at. And if things get worse, which they sort of have financially speaking in general in Pakistan in the last years, that might change things. So it's, I think, an open question. Then in terms of your question on politics, in general, when I'm in Pakistan, I try to avoid researching politics. I think I'm already on the radar of whoever has people on their radar. So I try to avoid doing that because mainly my research is much more on the sort of family and human level. And of course, I'm interested in the structural and systematic. But Pakistani politics is incredibly messy, and hard to make sense of. But we did, of course, come across it. It's everywhere, as it is in most contexts. So we had election campaign posters, and we did visit some of the local representatives. And indeed, they are Catholics in this area. And they stand with like different political parties. There's also, again, a regional aspect to this. So I'm not sure how many of you would remember this, but one of the former Pakistani governors was actually assassinated, basically because he stood up for a Christian woman who was wrongly accused of blasphemy, Basis. And he was killed several years ago by a security guard. So the issue around sort of Christian minorities, persecution, coexistence, and politics is very, very fraught. Um, However, at the local level in Lahore, when we were there were these minor hopeful signs. And again, you might say that that's, not important enough to really focus on. But this fact that there was a metro station that is being built takes a long time to build a metro system. So let's see when it's done. But it's being built. And the city has decided that the station is going to be called Youhanabad, which is a very Christian reference. And everyone knows it's the Christian neighborhood. And so people feel like that's a hopeful sign that they're being recognized as part of the kind of urban landscape and that the metro sign will be there and it's called like that. So that's also a political decision which has been, voted through at the city level, which says something, maybe. But I think definitely there's more that could be done to explore these things as well. And at the national level in Islamabad, it looks a bit different, I think, in terms of how the different Christian minorities work and how they're organized, as well. Final comment I wanted to pick on is in relation to your point on the sort of risk of becoming a ghetto. And I think that's really interesting, for a couple of reasons. And all of them, I think, were in your comments, Bernardo. So it's interesting because, yes, very clearly, there is this sense of more than ghetto, perhaps a safe haven. And that, if you live in Youhanabad, you're in, like, your house is somewhere where it's safe. And you can trust the people around you, at least largely, and you can work outside, as they would say, which is, literally across the street, but outside, in hospitals, or often also people work as guards, or again, in terms of repairs, other types of professions as well, mainly blue collar, but not only. And as I mentioned, also a lot of women who are nurses. But inside, it's such a religiously diverse area. And I sort of decided not to focus too much on that because I didn't want to do that at the expense of some of the more interesting parts, I think, in relation to Catholics in Asia specifically. But this extreme religious heterogeneity within this area, I think, in a different way, but it sort of resembles a little bit of what you were saying about Sinhala and Tamil Catholics. Like, at some level, the divisions within the Christian community in Youhanabad are just humongous. And so we interviewed and talked to sort of priests in all the major churches, and the major churches were the Church of Pakistan, the Catholic Church, the Methodists, and the Baptists. And they were all very much in agreement that they were the four kind of organized, established churches in the area. And they were also very much, they had regular meetings for all the kind of the leadership in these parishes and churches, and had very good dialogue to sort of manage things. But then they said, the challenge is that we have so many other Christian churches and entities that are on the range from very legitimate, very devout, types of Christian Protestant free churches and communities to charlatans. And in the 3 weeks we were there, we really saw all of that. And some of them are funded from abroad, many from the US, I'm sure with good intentions. And some of them have ties to other parts of Asia. A lot of Thai Baptist ties, which are really interesting to look at, and other kind of ties with specific parts of Asia at the kind of lower level as well. So I think in terms of the ghetto, it's kind of like, yes, maybe in the Christian sense, it becomes this sort of Christian, sort of fair variance of Christianity that is absolutely fascinating and a little bit horrifying in some ways. And then that means that a lot of attention maybe is also focused on the differences within Christian communities, between Christians, rather than also focusing on the outside. So I think there's something there with the minority majority. And just to end off, I think one of the questions that we stopped asking quite soon was about the proportions of different Christian denominations in the area. People have no idea, and there's so much politics in trying to enumerate that, and this sense that probably Catholics are in the majority, but that's going to end soon, from non-Catholics, to some of the Catholics saying, we really don't have any idea, we don't really know at all. And so I think just asking these questions also about proportions, whether it's about Muslims and Christians or whether it's within the Christian communities as well, it's interesting from a research perspective. But I think also the sort of dynamics of even asking that question are quite interesting and maybe not always advisable in all contexts. So I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marta. So we still have around 15 minutes for questions, comments from the members of the audience. So any question, comments? Feel free to use the chat section, or you can raise your virtual hands and you can, Yes, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Marta, for this very rich presentation. In a corner of Asia that we don't often touch on, or we hear news from it, but that's it. So anyway, allow me to go back to a detail that you mentioned, the coffee. I am an anthropologist, as you know, and I feel sometimes there are some very concrete elements that can help us to kind of trace back how those politics of coexistence and religious diversity and relation take shape in real life. So could you tell us a bit more about precisely food? How does it manage food distinctions? Or because I worked on Christians in China, and even Christians in China develop their own specific food signature to distinguish themselves in a world that has a very there is no, I mean, it's not a Muslim world, the Chinese world. So the food taboo or the food landscape, it's very, I guess it's quite different from Pakistan. So in Singapore, so it's a rich topic of research and conversation about food and religion. So how that work in your case, since you talk about coffee? Is coffee the Christian signature by opposition to tea or I don't know what, but in more general, how is food mobilized to negotiate, to build bridges, to build a sense of sharing, but also a sense of distinction in this particular environment?
Should I just answer, Bubbles?
Yeah, yes, please. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. I should probably stress that I don't think the level of drinking espresso is very high in Youhanabad. I think maybe it was me being very, very happy to see the espresso after a couple of weeks of wonderful Pakistani tea, but some change is nice. So in general, the tea culture in Youhanabad, I would say resembles the tea culture in the rest of Punjab entirely. There's no difference in that sense. But interestingly, food was a topic of discussion. I think it's mentioned a bit in the chapter, but we didn't go too much into detail on it in a couple of ways. So there were a lot of butchers that I mentioned also in the opening vignette. So we were sort of surprised because in general in Pakistan, meat consumption, of course, is on the rise, and especially of chicken. Less so, of course, of mutton because it's much more expensive, and being a Muslim country, pork really isn't an option. And so there's a lot of butchers there who sell chicken, and we were surprised by the density. So we kept having conversations around whether, for some reasons, Christians are better at selling chicken than Muslims, and that Muslims come and buy chicken from the Christians. And certainly, there's no way all these shops could thrive off just selling chicken to inhabitants of Youhanabad. And they were on the main road, so just by the entry gates. So we tried to sort of observe a bit, but we weren't really able in our 3-week fieldwork to get to the bottom of this question of, where does this meat come from? And who is actually buying it? And who is, paying for that? And who is ultimately eating it? But I think that would be really interesting to find out. One other thing we did find out, not just in terms of the butchers, but some of the other shops, also grocery shops, but also actually other shops as well, was that there was an interesting dynamic of who was perhaps owning the building, who was owning the business itself, and who was employed in the shop or in the outlet itself. And so we had a mix of, for instance, a Muslim owning the building. So someone who'd bought it from a Christian at some point in the last 50 years. Perhaps there could then be a Christian who was actually owning the business of this shop, selling the chicken, for instance. But actually, then there might be a Muslim who might be working in the shop selling it. And in a few cases, we also found Hindus and Sikhs. According to our survey, there were no Sikhs in Youhanabad, but we found 2 shops that were Sikh with Sikh signs in front of them. So we also saw some signs of more religious mixing in this space, perhaps because it's seen as a different space to other spaces in Lahore, with more tolerance of different religions and sort of non-Muslim religious expressions more generally. But I do think food in this context is really interesting. I'm not entirely sure whether I would assume the differences in food between Muslims and Catholics or Christians in general in Pakistan actually are that big. And particularly also because alcohol is permitted for Christians and non-Muslims in general. But there is the sale of alcohol also in Youhanabad. It's quite contentious. There are, of course, as there are anywhere where we have alcohol, issues with abusing alcohol and with dependence, and a lot of challenges in relation to who is selling alcohol to whom, and whether people are, obeying the rules or not. So quite a lot of sort of conflicts around the question of alcohol in all kinds of ways. But on the other hand, drugs came up so much more in our discussions, and that's very similar to what I see in other research I've done in Pakistan, that, challenges with addiction among young people in general are a challenge. Parents are concerned about that. And that then doesn't really make so much of a difference whether it's alcohol or whether it's other types of drugs, where this religious difference wouldn't, it's equally bad for anyone, right? So I'm not quite sure how the religious distinction would play out, but I would agree it's a very important topic to look further into, both objects and food and substances.
Thank you very much, Marta. Zara has a comment/question in the chat box. But Zara, would you like to read your question to Marta? If not, maybe the question basically is, I think, a kind of elaboration on why young Christians still want to live in Youhanabad despite several push factors being identified, or she has 2 small questions. Is it about living in Youhanabad or fears of leaving home and identity back at home?
Yes, I'm sort of interpreting. Thank you so much for the question, Zara. And I interpret it a bit to mean, in terms of the places people have come from, in terms of leaving home. I mean, I think really what we found was that Youhanabad is a very interesting and sort of but also then a very unique case. So it's not like anywhere else in Pakistan. I think there are sort of debates about whether or not it is the biggest urban neighborhood of Christians in a country which is not majority Christian. I think that can be debated, and anyone who is a scholar of urban context in Asia would probably agree that no one knows. But it really is a very, very particular kind of place. But I would maybe like to stress that among the people that we spoke with, often it was their parents who left, often rural or even more often perhaps small town. So not perhaps a village, but very, very small towns in Punjab to come to Youhanabad, often perhaps when their children maybe were quite young. So our interlocutors maybe were people who were born in a village and they moved as a child, for instance, but they would not necessarily have that much experience of life really in that original home place. But it was interesting how, to a lesser degree, I found than in many other contexts in Pakistan, this sense of going back to the village was maintained, because often maybe there wasn't anyone left there. So like whole families would go. Not always. There would sometimes be sort of areas where there was perhaps a Catholic church and a community where they would want to go back to, but not always. So there's something about sense of home and rupture that's definitely there, and where Youhanabad plays a very significant role, becoming a new sort of home there.
Thanks very much. We don't have a lot of time, but I think it's similar to Carling's work on voluntary, involuntary non-migrants, and oftentimes we do not discuss that in migration studies. Those who choose to stay, oftentimes we think of them as left behind, but those who choose to stay are often not discussed. So we also have a question from Brian. And I think we can all relate to this. As social scientists, Like, how does a Catholic researcher researching about Catholicism negotiate their positionality, perspective, biases, and how do we strive to distance ourselves and to appear objective, if there is such a thing indeed? And or is there somewhere in between, or how do we navigate it?
Thanks. Yes, indeed. I think it's a question most of us grapple with, if not struggle with. I guess my personal take on this has been that when I started doing my PhD, I was doing work on remittances from Pakistanis living in Norway and did research in Pakistan and in Norway around that. And my Catholic identity was neither here nor there to that, really. Until I realized that what people sometimes were talking about, which I think we can frame as lived religion, was very obvious to me. And it wasn't necessarily to my supervisors or to other people who'd written about the same community. Not because they were doing bad research, but it's just about the lenses through which we see the world, I think. And so then I started asking questions to, interviewees and during field work, what is this and how is that linked to that? And then people would say things like, well, the money that I told you that I sent to my brother, actually that's sort of part of sadaqah, or the way that we think in Islam about helping others. Or they would say, maybe that's zakat. And then someone else would butt in and say, well, you don't give zakat like that. And then so religion kind of filtered into the work that I was doing then in the Islamic context, which I then didn't really have to relate as a Catholic. It was more like I'm not an anthropologist, but I'm still trying to kind of observe what are people saying, what is going on, and how can I understand their universe of meaning in their own lives on their own terms. And so then religion wasn't really part of the focus at all. But as it often happens, it turned out that it was an aspect. Not the only, of course, but it was an aspect. And so from then, I've sort of tried to see, well, in the questions that I ask and in the things that I try to understand, how can I make sure I don't ignore religion just because perhaps there is this secular bias? And I do think that there is a secular bias, at least in Europe. I'm based in Norway. It's definitely very much true here. And there is, to a large extent, at least has been until quite recently, a sort of fear to touch religion at all because, it might be dangerous, or I don't know, it might do something to you or the research, or it might not seem proper. I think that's changing, and especially in disciplines like anthropology, there's of course been much more sensitivity to that for a long time. Sometimes it's been siloed, I guess, but I think there's more openness now to sort of understand sort of intersectional links. And sort of again, just to conclude, from my own part, I decided after quite a long time as a researcher that it was safe to actually be more open about my own identity. But I deliberately did not do that as a PhD student for the kinds of reasons which I think shine through in this question. I'm not sure that's good or ethical or anything. It's more just an honest reflection on my journey. But thanks for asking. It's a very important question.
Thanks very much, Marta. I think there's a life course stages that we all go through that once we become a little bit more, perhaps more advanced in the academic journey, we are more comfortable to say and to be more open with our positionality. We still have 2 minutes. Maybe I think Joanna also touched on this same topic on objectivity and how do we navigate, especially during secular age, and Marta already responded. Are there other questions perhaps from the audience? The last one. Michelle is very strict when it comes to time. Any other questions, comments, perhaps that I may have missed in the chat? We still have 2 minutes. I think we can still have no more. Michelle is shaking his head. So while we are waiting for the very last question, the last but not the least, we would like to thank our audience. I know the time in Asia is already a bit late, like in Seoul now and in Japan, perhaps it's almost 11 p.m. So I would like to thank for the other parts of, if you're in the other parts of the world, it's too early in the morning. So we would like to extend our deepest thanks to the members of the audience who joined us today and who always, for those who are regular, who regularly join us. So thank you very much. And I would also like to thank, on behalf of ISAC, our esteemed speaker for today, Marta, for her time and for her willingness to share her work with us, especially those who are working on topics on Asian Catholics. So thank you very much. We hope to see you again next time when we have the same kind of webinar. So thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy your night. You have a restful sleep, a good day, and enjoy your day ahead for those who are just starting their day. Thank you very much.